Hello students, this is your review for Federal Government Part 2. There are 50 questions on the exam. They are all multiple choice and maybe fill in the blank or something too. Mainly multiple choice. Okay, and you have, it is timed, so you have to work on the schedule. You have a certain amount of time for completion of the exam. You can use your book, but you can't refer to it too much because you'll run out of time. Also, you cannot have outside help on the exam. Unlike the inquisitives where you can have outside help, you can get help from your older brother or sister that you think smarter than you. That's on the inquisitives, but on your exams you have to work alone, just with your book. Okay. On the media takes an adversarial journalism position when it reports skeptical news. In other words, scandals, something that the whoever they're reporting on is not going to like. Okay. Despite widespread availability, the national range of topics provided the least depth of coverage of news is television. Television, is very limited. You watch the news and they have just, small segments of what's going on in the country. Newspapers do a better job. Magazines do a better job. Even the internet does a better job. Radio does a better job. Television, is okay, but just realize that you're only getting a tidbit of the news. You need to subscribe to a print newspaper in order to get a better picture of what's going on in the world. Okay. A political ideology is best defined as a cohesive set of beliefs that form a general philosophy about the government. That is called political ideology. Political ideologies are like liberalism, conservatism, socialism, libertarianism, or whatever. But that is are examples of political ideologies. One thing that Americans all agree on is that our government is based upon liberty, equality of opportunity, and democracy. Equality of opportunity, that doesn't mean that you are guaranteed a good result. You are not guaranteed to succeed in life, but you are guaranteed having an equal opportunity to do so. An individual who strongly supports military intervention and maintenance of American military power is more closely associated with conservatism. Libertarianism emphasizes freedom and voluntary association with small government. They are for small government, small taxation, which sounds good, but then you take a closer look and they are also opposed to all aid, financial aid for education, because they say, well, small government, the government needs to stay out of that business. Okay. A liberal would most likely argue in favor of more progressive taxation. That progressive meaning that people who make more money or who have more wealth would be taxed at a higher rate than people who make less income or have less wealth. They would also favor strong reproductive rights. In other words, choice for a woman concerning abortion, and also foreign aid to poorer nations. Liberalism and conservatism are examples of political ideology. And concerning abortion, conservatives would be opposed to legalized abortion, whereas liberals would be more inclined to favor legalized abortion as an example of political ideology. Men are more supportive of Donald Trump's presidency than women. People who have gone to college and people who have not, the main difference is that those people with a higher level of political participation among those with a college education. The two criteria that determine how active someone is politically, whether they vote or not, as a basic form of political activity, is how much education they have, and also how much income they have. And guess what? Those two kind of go together. You get a good education, you'll probably make more money in your life. Okay, so if you have a higher level of education, you probably also have a higher level of income, and you tend to be more politically involved. Why? Because you're smart. You're smart enough to know that it matters. Large cities are basically democratic strongholds, whereas rural areas are predominantly Republican strongholds. And political scientists take analysis and guesses at why that is, but that's the way it is. Okay, Franklin D. Roosevelt, during the Great Depression of the 1930s, where everyone was very anxious and depressed and wondering what the next day was going to bring, he had fireside chats where he went on the radio. In those days, we didn't have television, so in order to communicate with people, you had to go on the radio, which he did, and he did that once a week, and he had a fireside chat where he talked to the American people and let them know how things were going in fighting the Great Depression and later fighting the Nazis in World War II. In opinion polls, picking a small group of people to poll is called a sample. And pollsters endeavor to have a sample that is representative of what they're trying to poll. If they're trying to poll political opinion in, say, a congressional district, then they want to pick a group of people who reflect the makeup of that congressional district. For example, if the congressional district is, say, 20% African American, then they want their sample to be 20% African American. If it's 55% female, then they want their sample to reflect that, and so on and so on. And it goes all the way through age and income and educational level and so forth. Basically, they want to get 1,000 people who reflect the area that they are trying to poll, and that would give them a margin of error of less than 4%. Okay, there's an effect in polling called the social desirability effect. That is, sometimes people would respond to a pollster's question based upon what they think the pollster wants to hear. And so that is not a reliable or accurate poll. And so polls can even be what's called push polls, where the questions that are answered by the pollster are designed to elicit a particular answer because they want to load up the results of the poll to reflect what they want to reflect. During the 2020 Democratic presidential campaign, Joe Biden lost the first 4 primaries, but then in a key state of South Carolina, he won a convincing victory, and then he went on, obviously, to win the presidential nomination for the Democratic Party. And after he won the primary in South Carolina, the media started talking about a bandwagon effect or a momentum effect, so forth, and of course that helped out getting more votes for the candidate. The fact that the media was talking about it in those terms. And when pollsters are doing the polling, seemingly minor differences in the wording of a question can make a whole bit of difference. For example, if a poll is being conducted and the pollster asks, "Are you in favor of welfare?" Well, he's going to get an answer of some sort, and it will probably not be a positive answer. But if the pollster says, "Are you in favor of assistance for the poor?" then probably there's more likely that you're going to say yes, okay, and give a positive, just depending upon the wording of the poll. Okay, so pollsters, legitimate pollsters, are very careful in not loading their questions to get a desired result. So you have to look at reliable polls in order to get a true picture of what's going on in the world. And political candidates and political officials pay a great deal of attention to polls, even though they may deny that they do. Of course, if they're showing well in the polls, they brag about it. They say, "Oh, I'm leading in by three percentage points in this poll." Okay, but if they're trailing by 3% or 5% or 10%, then basically they're either not going to talk about the poll or they're going to say, "Oh, well, polls don't matter." If a number of newspapers are publishing stories exposing an elected official's acceptance of monetary bribes from a corporation in exchange for passing a particular law, it would be an example of watchdog journalism. In other words, the newspapers are being a watchdog to discover and expose corruption, and we see that in the newspapers and on television from time to time. In fact, fairly often. Media is often referred to as the fourth branch of the government. The first three, of course, are the legislative, the judicial, and the executive departments, and the presidency. So they are referred to as the fourth branch of government, because they provide a check on the power of the other three branches. Okay, when news occurs, every day, every morning, every evening, journalists have to decide which stories to talk about, which stories to analyze and to give reporting time to. And so, question might be that, well, what if an economics professor is giving testimony to a congressional committee on the effect of tariffs? Okay, is the media going to give much coverage to that? No. Why not? Because people don't have a strong interest in that. But if they're reporting on a sex scandal or a celebrity wedding like a royal wedding in Britain or something of that nature, then those are the stories that get the most play. So the media essentially sets the agenda. They determine what you're going to watch when you watch the news on TV, or what you're going to read if you're going to read the news in the newspaper, or whatever. They are determining what you're going to hear about. And of course, there's a decreasing number of companies that own the media. They are becoming like an oligarchy. And the risk of that is that political candidates or parties that don't have great appeal or engaged in promoting unpopular causes or something, they're not going to get the coverage that other candidates or other parties are going to get. And also, bias. Bias gets into coverage. In fact, you as an individual, you select your bias, because if you're watching a TV channel that is a conservative, Republican-oriented channel like Fox News or what is it, Newsmax, then you're going to get a conservative, Republican point of view on the news. If you're watching MSNBC, one of the commentary programs on it in the evening, like Larry O'Donnell or Rachel Maddow, or Stephanie Rule, then you're going to get a more liberal Democratic viewpoint on the news. So you select it. You also select it on the internet. If you are going to internet sites that are very right-wing, that's the slant that you're going to get on the news. If you're going to websites that are very left-wing, you're going to get that slant. Even if you're going to something in the middle, you're still going to get a slant one way or another. There's just no escaping it. That's one thing that some political scientists claim has caused the division that we see in political opinion in the United States. That several decades ago, there were only three sources of news. There's ABC, NBC, and CBS. That was it. Okay, you got all your news from one of those channels, and they all basically report the same news the same way. Okay, now you got news sources on the internet, everything from extreme right-wing neo-Nazi, Ku Klux Klan, conspiracy, QAnon conspiracies, all the way from that, all the way to socialism, communism, anarchism. You can see anything you want on the internet. And so we have, literally hundreds or even thousands of sources of information to choose from. And according to what you choose to watch and listen to, that's going to shape your political philosophy. Okay. The number of newspaper journalists, that is, newspaper reporters, working in the United States has decreased by 50%. There are not as many newspaper reporters out there digging out corruption, digging out the news, digging out the facts as there used to be. And of course, the media source that reaches the most Americans is television. But you only get tidbits of news on television. In order to get in-depth news, you have to go to the internet or newspapers or magazines. Okay, sometimes there's a not question on an exam, like which of the following is not a reason why many Americans appear to prefer online news. Many Americans prefer to get their news online. One reason that is not a reason is the accuracy and objectivity compared to traditional media outlets. In other words, it's like the opposite. When you get your news online, you're going to get more of a bias, more of a slant, than less accurate news than if you are relying on traditional media outlets like newspapers or television. There's something called fake news. For example, in the 2016 presidential election, there was fake news that gained wide circulation all over social media and the internet and so forth, that the Pope had endorsed Donald Trump for president. Of course, that wasn't true, but that message reached a huge audience of people, and who knows how many of them were influenced by it. Okay. And of course, we mentioned that the media has the agenda-setting power. They set the agenda, what's going to be discussed on the news, what's going to be discussed in Congress, what they're going to report on, what they're not going to report on, because they can't report on everything. There are hundreds, dozens, hundreds, thousands of different things going on every day in the United States, and they can only report on a handful. And of course they look for the news that is going to have the most dramatic and entertainment value to report on. They love to report on scandals, sex scandals, other scandals. Okay, low-level officials that bring forth information on the agency that they work for are called whistleblowers, because they are bringing forth adverse information on the agency that they work for, or the company they work for. Okay, the journalists, the media did a lot of reporting on the Mueller investigation during the Trump administration. That's called adversarial journalism. That is, they were reporting on an investigation that was bringing forth facts and allegations that were not favorable to President Trump. So it's called adversarial journalism. There's another kind of journalism called access journalism, where journalists, they cotton up to elected officials because they want to preserve their access. Because if they are writing a lot of critical stories about a public official, then that public official may cut them off and not return their phone calls, not invite them to their parties or their meetings. In other words, they cut off the access because they don't like what that reporter is saying about them. And that's called access journalism. Well, the access journalism would be the opposite of a reporter hesitating about reporting adverse information on an official for fear that they will lose access. So that would be access journalism, as opposed to adversarial journalism. And the only media that's regulated by the federal government is television, because you have to have a license to operate a television station. In 1996, the Telecommunications Act was ended because it was ended. What it did was it provided that media had to give balanced information over their media. In other words, if you had a radio station and you were having Republicans come on and you're interviewing them, you also had to have some Democrats come on and interview them too. Just in other words, it's called the equal time or the fair play doctrine. Well, it was abolished. So that's why basically radio stations are about 90% conservative stations, Republican-leaning stations, and they don't have to balance it out with inviting Democrats to come on and give their viewpoints. Interest groups are interested in policies, not personnel. They don't care who the candidate is. All they care about is how they're going to vote on issues that are important to that interest group. Throughout history, we've always had two major parties. They've gone by different names from time to time, but there's always been two, because we have a winner-take-all system, that we don't have proportional representation. You have an election, and whoever wins, and the other one goes home. It's like a football game. There's a winner and a loser, and the loser goes home. George Washington warned us about political parties, said that they were a potential danger. The formal structure of a political party is leadership, election committees, members, and usually paid staff. That's how a party is organized. And parties serve the useful purpose of recruiting candidates for office. And once the election is held, when the election's over, it's the political party that's in the majority that organizes the Congress. They select who the Speaker of the House is going to be, who the committee chairs are going to be, and who the majority leader is going to be. They select that. And of course, the party with less members, they select the minority leader and the minority office holders in the party. Okay, Democratic Party would be most favorable toward expanding funding for education, public spending for infrastructure, and raising taxes on the wealthy and corporations. The Republican Party would be most interested in maintaining high levels of military spending, instituting tax relief for upper income voters, and reducing corporate taxes. Of course, those are just our examples of positions that the two parties take. It has always been the case that there's more people who identify as Democrats than Republicans. But it seems that the Republicans wind up winning a lot of elections because Republicans do a very, very good job of turning out their voters. And so it doesn't matter what the polls say. If you don't turn out your voters, you lose. If you do turn out your voters, even though the polls may show that most of the people in the district or state that you're running in, most voters favor you, if you don't turn out those voters, it doesn't count, and you lose. And your opponent, if your opponent does a better job of turning out his or her voters, then they win. You don't win. Okay, there's something called a party activist. That's somebody who participates in the party, contributes money, comes to meetings, maybe even runs for office. Okay, that concludes your review for the federal government exam on part 2. And wish you luck on the exam. Remember, you have to work on it on your own. You cannot have outside help. You can use your textbook, but like I said, you can't use it too much because there's not time. It is a timed exam. Okay, so have good luck on the exam, and we'll be seeing you next time.